Hello, let's talk about Midnight in Chernobyl. The untold story of the world's greatest nuclear disaster. The nuclear plant in Chernobyl melted down in 1986, and very slowly the news got out. This is the whole story of that event, told by Alan Higginbotham, a British journalist. In his 2019 book. Actually, it was a very big year for that, because there was another book that also came out at the same year, which focuses on the same events, but I'll talk about that one later. So yeah, this recounts the immediate events of the Chernobyl nuclear plant in 1986, the history that led up to it, and the massive operation to contain and seal up the site afterwards. So Higginbotham does a good job of while he's recounting kind of the hourly, minute by minute events that on the days that of leading up to, and the explosion of, and the scramble to try and contain and deal with the horrible environmental catastrophe that happened at this plant. He does a good background of giving the background of the USSR at this point, which Ukraine was a part of at this point, and at some point, was a part of at this point. The idea of that, the USSR was this big top down structure with a gigantic kind of political wing that set ridiculous targets and goals that expected them to be met, but would accept them being results being falsified as long as the numbers looked good on the paper. So you've got that kind of a culture going. You have the flaw of the actual plant design, the design for the nuclear plant that they went with. Higginbotham does a fairly good job of explaining some of the science behind nuclear power plants. This seems to come down to the idea that you can have a power plant where if it has a dead man switch, where if all the coolant suddenly evaporates, it just automatically shuts down, or you can make it so that if all the coolant evaporates, that it will just ramp up and ramp up and ramp up and melt down. And this is unfortunately what they went for a variety of reasons. This is very much Higginbotham makes the point of saying that a lot of this first kind of the generations of nuclear power plants were based on the idea of them from military use, where they were trying to get radioactive material to produce for weapons and things like this, weapon grade uranium and things like this, so they're going for a certain kind of nuclear power plant that are gigantic. The USSR very much has this kind of gigantic mode thing of we have to make everything super big. Unfortunately, making it so big, what should have happened is it should have had a containment kind of structure over top of it, some kind of cement structure over top of it, but it was decided that would double or quadruple the cost of the plant if they actually went through with that. So they didn't, because they decided this will never fail. It's superior Soviet technology. It can never fail, which is, it's famous last words. Now, the problem with this is that right from the start, the Soviet scientists realized, oh, this has got several things that are really dangerous with it. We don't want to admit we've done anything wrong, so we'll institute regulations, but we're not going to actually let the people who are running the power plants know that that you have to follow these regulations for what reasons. Like, if you don't do this, then the whole fucking thing will explode. They didn't share that. This is one of these super secret, it's a secretive society. They did not share that information. They didn't want to admit mistakes. They just said, just do the regulations. But you combine that with a society where you have ridiculous targets, where you have all these pressures, kind of just a culture where you you just disregard. You get, oh, the top guys tell you lots of stuff, but you just do what you can do, and you kind of disregard them. This is not a culture where you're going to follow things very precisely and accurately. It's like, no, you kind of get things right. You sort of get things done correctly. And so all that leads to them having to like, oh, we only have this one window to operate this test, which should have been run when the plant was actually was opened. We can only do it here because if we shut down the power anywhere else, it will interfere with all the other industries who need to get their quotas done, hurry and get their quotas done before the end of whatever I think it's the May Day parade, because the disaster happens in April. You have to get it all done before that. So they run this test disregarding stuff, and all these elements combine together to the plant goes into meltdown. They're supposed to put rods down. It's supposed to be one of these things where you mechanically put rods down into the thing and it'll cool it off. Instead, it had the opposite effect, which they hadn't been told might be a case, where it had a massive spike in energy and melted everything and blew the top off of the reactor that did not have a cover on it. So it was opened, the internal of this super radioactive, super deadly plant was exposed to the air and shot radioactive chunks of stuff onto all the buildings around it, and released a massive radioactive cloud of gunk into the air, which then traveled across Ukraine into northern Europe, where, because of the secrecy, this is a time when Gorbachev was in power and was instituting glasnost, which was supposed to be openness. The Soviets just could not really let go of the whole thing of, we need to keep things secret. We don't want to embarrass ourselves, embarrass the status of Soviet scientists. So you have nuclear plants in Northern Europe going, oh, our alarms are going off. Is there something wrong with our nuclear plants? No, there isn't. It's the cloud coming from Chernobyl drifting across and making people radioactive. Higginbotham does a really good job of dramatizing all this. I went through all this section, and people getting exposed to massive levels of radiation, and indeed the initial kind of crews, the firefighting crews, I think they do die. But there's so many other people that I thought, okay, you're dead, you're all dead, that surprisingly at least survive initially. There's this frustration with this of the Soviets either suppressed or just on purpose didn't collect data to track exactly what was the extent, what was the fallout of this. We know that, I think we know from European sources of people getting cancer. That seems to be tracked down to this, but there's a lot of other ways that Higginbotham at the end is like, we're never going to know how many people this ended up eventually killing, because he talks about studies about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where they actually did do studies of okay, there's the people obviously who died instantaneously, there's people who died a couple of weeks later, but then just doing kind of further out and being able to them actually tracking that with how kind of there's just sort of a background level of people who are going to be just dying of cancer anyways. So it's kind of it's rather hard to find. It's rather hard to find, actual data on that. It's somewhat frustrating that way. But this is really told minute by minute. You get the kind of the general idea of the science, which I probably butchered right now. You get a sense of the history. He does go a little bit into kind of the political fallout from this. Gorbachev believing that this is one of the major things that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. It took it took about the equivalent of the budget of a full year of their defense budget to be able to massive operation, because then they did have to actually put a cap on top of Chernobyl, and just the massive kind of trying to clean up all the particulates and everything, and chopping down radioactive forests and burying all this stuff, and the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, and Higginbotham setting up before, like, how there was this ideal kind of worker city that was where all the workers came from to go to the Chernobyl plant, and how that had to be abandoned as well, because it's right beside that. It's surprisingly at the end, Higginbotham is not blanket negative on nuclear power, saying that that the future is of the next generation of nuclear power plants are going to be smaller, non-military based reactors, based on different radioactive materials, maybe the shorter half-life. I mean, I have to say, kind of reading the book though, he does give the background of, you have disasters in both the UK and in the US, 3 Mile Island, where it's like things, and even in democratic capitalist societies have plenty of their own weaknesses over safety. Boy, are we going to really trust business with something as toxic and something that can go so badly wrong as nuclear power? I mean, we have a horrible enough record with all of the other mining, mercury, the mercury, the gas, the fracking, all this sort of horribly destructive stuff on our environment. Are we really prepared to, widespread have nuclear power plants? Is that really the best way to go? I mean, people who are smarter than me are probably going to work that out and probably violently disagree with each other. They do already. It's so, as a feeling a little bit queasy at the end of the book, not knowing like how many people actually died, and Higginbotham not being, I mean, maybe that's just me of like a gut reaction, and that's not the gut reactions, emotional reactions is not the way we're going to deal with energy problems, need for our insatiable need for energy, and how to balance that out and not, end up in a nuclear fucking wasteland at the end of it all of that. So yeah, the book isn't so much into the kind of the political ramifications, social ramifications of the Ukraine and the Soviet Union. It does get mentioned. Apparently, the other book that was published at the same time, called Chernobyl: The History of a Nuclear Disaster by Serhiy Plonky, is much more into the kind of the political, social stuff within the Ukraine itself. Plonky is American Ukrainian historian, whereas Higginbotham is definitely writing this as a journalist, and it's probably more readable. Sounds like it's this book, Mdnght and Chernobyl, is like a kind of sort of thriller, whereas it sounds like Plonky is a bit more of historian historian kind of level of writing, which might be interesting to read after having read this as kind of my starter book on it. But yeah, I enjoyed it. It's definitely a very, very readable, very pacey book, very kind of emotionally engaging, which, is good. It's good. It really gets you involved. Maybe it's good to balance that out with Plonky's, whatever, however you say his name, which I guess I would have to learn if I actually read it and review it. Actually, one of the other things, I watched interviews with Higginbotham, and he mentioned A Night to Remember, which is a 1955 account of the sinking of the Titanic, which also has, it's this large event with some, technology that can't fail, with a large cast of people, and very, very much on that book, because I'm almost 80% of the way through it, is very much focused on that night and what happens, with a little bit on, you know, how or what happened to the boat, but not kind of getting into the wonky James Cameron level of detail on all the stuff. But yeah, an interesting book on itself, and one that I'm glad I picked up. It's definitely, you can see that Mdnght in Chernobyl continues a genre of, you know, talking about technology, disastrous technology, and stuff that had real cultural impact on our society, about, like, you know, the way we think about, you know, technology with the Titanic, the way we think about technology with Chernobyl, and how far reaching that has been, and also how we're, after a couple of generations, it's easy for us to forget maybe lessons that we should perhaps remember. Just putting it out there. All right. So yes, that has been my rambly thoughts on Mdnght in Chernobyl by Alan Higginbotham. I've been Jay. More videos later.